Good evening, colleagues who are joining us from different parts of the world. Very delighted to be hosting this particular breakaway session, which, as we all have been informed, is really looking at the ongoing assessment we are giving to how we reach goal 16 and how we look at COVID-19 and its impact on delivering justice to justice seekers as well as to institutions that deliver justice. My name is Depros Muchena. I am joining you from Johannesburg. I am the Regional Director at Amnesty International for East and Southern Africa. That's what I do on my day job, a friend of IDLO. So very happy to be having this conversation with you. It's really a pleasure that we are meeting again with some of you who are delivering justice in many different parts of the world. Assessing and mitigating the impact of the pandemic on justice systems and justice seekers is exactly what we will be receiving from the panel. I should begin by saying that this session will be recorded, and it's also being live streamed on IDLO's Facebook channel. So it is accessible via the conference website. Please also note that there is simultaneous translation or interpretation for English, French, Spanish, and Italian, and that is being provided during this session. The chat function is enabled, and attendees can send chat messages to the host, as well as panelists and attendees via the in-meeting chat. So let's use that. This session is framed in terms of 5 guiding questions that you can also see being posted on the chat. And I just want to repeat the guiding questions that we have shared with all members of the panel. The first question that we are asking is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected access to and quality of justice and progress towards SDG 16 from the vantage point of where you sit and where you operate from? And particularly for those most at risk in this world, those who have been left behind or those who need protection of the law the most. That's the first guiding questions that we have set to panelists. The second is, how has the justice sector responded to emerging justice needs during COVID-19 pandemic? And the third is, what are some of the examples of innovative practices in the justice sector, such as digital innovation and alternative dispute resolution, and how can they help advance progress on the goal of achieving access to justice for all by 2030? The fourth question is, what role can justice systems play in promoting a more peaceful, equitable, and sustainable COVID-19 recovery? And the last question, certainly but not least from the point of view of the audience, if they so wish to ask questions after the presentation, is, what are the lessons that we have learned from the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 pandemic on correctional systems and prisoners in particular, and how will the lessons that we have drawn help to build prisons back better? This notion of building back better has been discussed in a range of audiences in the last couple of months, including by President Joe Biden himself when he was presenting his presidency. So we have a panel that is going to help us open this conversation to us and really drill into the various questions that we have asked them to prepare. And this panel is quite qualified, have been working on justice issues, and we will be able to raise questions with them. I will be referring to their bios as they come to speak so that we do not spend a lot of time introducing them. So I'll be introducing them as and when they come to speak. We had been promised that we will be getting the acting minister for human rights from Honduras, but that is no longer the case. That has been changed. We now have a replacement, but the replacement that we got is equally supremely qualified to speak to this subject, and I think we're very honored to have our first speaker who will speak for 5 minutes, maximum 7 minutes, and I'm really asking panelists to keep that time so that we can have as much discussion as we need to have. The first presenter, of course, is Advocate Rosa Amalia Seaman Sharon, who is the Undersecretary of State of the Office for the Protection of Human Rights in Honduras. Rosa Amalia Seaman Sharon is a human rights lawyer with a master's degree in international law and human rights, obtained from the University of Paris. She was the Director of Control of Conventionality of the Secretariat of Human Rights, former prosecutor in the public ministry with experience in vulnerable groups such as women, childhood human rights defenders deprived of liberty, among others. She has been an independent consultant on various issues related to indigenous people, the environment, arbitrary detentions, and forced disappearance, as well as cases before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. In fact, the Juan Humberto Sanchez versus Honduras case comes to mind as one that Rosa has worked on. So we are not going to struggle here to listen to a person who has understood the work of people who are excluded from the justice system, people who are essentially in the minority when it comes to access, but a practitioner, and if I need to say, activist on issues of human rights and protection. So I want to ask you, Advocate, to come and speak for 5 minutes. Advocate Rosa, speak for 5 minutes to 7 minutes across the questions that we have shared with you, so that we can move to the next. So over to you. I'm sure you will be speaking. If you are speaking in Spanish, you will get an interpretation for your speech. But over to you, Rosa.
Buenos días a todos y a todas. Es un placer para mí, en representación de la Secretaría de Derechos Humanos de Honduras, estar con ustedes en este importante foro, en esta sesión paralela. Y agradezco mucho la presentación de nuestro
participate in this very important forum, in this parallel session, and I thank the kind moderator for the very kind introduction he made by describing my activity. So I will be very brief. Obviously, the current pandemic has exacerbated the situation of human rights, hitting people all over the world. The national governments have established an emergency state by limiting to a certain extent also the access to justice. And even the free circulation of people has been limited due to the pandemic. And this is a right of people, we know, but all rights have been somewhat limited because we know that the circulation of people has been limited, and also the access to courts and to justice in general, seeking for the fulfillment and demand for rights. All these measures were taken in the name of health protection, but as the time went by, the governments had to also introduce a number of public measures after full lockdown. We had to introduce measures to limit the circulation of people. And so we had to limit the freedom of people. And during the pandemic, we've also witnessed to an exponential growth of reports about violence on women. Clearly enough, the lockdown has created very difficult situations where women have been most hit by the violence. Due to such a situation, we had to create and establish more places where these cases could be handled in order really to face such a plague, we may call it this way. Undoubtedly, women are extremely exposed here and are vulnerable very often, and in particular in our country, because we have created a special court for women's rights and also a platform to listen to the cases of gender violence. But we are faced with a challenge. And this is one of the cases when the pandemic actually forced us to get digitized and introduce high technologies very quickly. And we know that the citizens of African descent probably and other marginalized minorities did not could not access such a new methodology. And this certainly means a very difficult challenge to our countries. How can we ensure and guarantee that these people can access justice once they haven't got yet an access to technology? And then, of course, this is one of the goals of the SDG 16, which includes human rights and the building of peaceful, equitable, and inclusive societies, as we all know. We should not only fight the pandemic, but last year we've also suffered the severe effects and consequences of the hurricanes. And so we must build ethical and responsible societies which can face such challenges in order to build back a society which is both peaceful and equitable and fair and inclusive. So we have really started an endeavor of national reconstruction, because the public sector has to find a right and effective response to pandemic, at the same time ensuring access to justice for everybody. We know that the 2014 ruling of the National Court of Justice was based on a very long legislative process, because we are forced to introduce technical measures in order to digitize computerize the access to justice for everybody. And we committed to this. And so the hearings now shouldn't necessarily take place in presence, but they can also be developed and take place virtually. So we have actually introduced new procedures to prepare hearings and to write the petitions and the acts, trying to streamline the whole process and expedite it. With these new systems we have introduced, new technological systems we have introduced, we are trying to improve our justice systems for them to be up to the situation. And we've also started cooperation with the DOC of the United Nations in order to combat the drug use and international crime. So we have a very close cooperation, which is, of course, a step forward for our country. And also the High Commissioner of the United Nations for Human Rights has opened an office in our country. And so we are closely in contact with such an office. And we've also planned for this year to launch a new reform of justice process. So, for instance, law bill has been already submitted to reform the justice system. And also a number of accompanying rules that will be developed progressively for the implementation of the various rules foreseen by the reform. Of course, delivering justice is absolutely essential in order to really recovery from the plague of COVID-19. We have to ensure people the possibility to be heard and to access justice in general. In Honduras, we succeeded in making important improvements. And in particular, we are improving the situation of the population of African descent, of indigenous peoples, and minors or teenagers who are very often still suffering violence, in particular during the pandemic. And so we have learned a lot during this pandemic. We've learned our lessons. And so thanks to the lawyers bar of Honduras, we are planning to insist with the regulating body for justice in Honduras so that urgent measures are introduced for all people who struggle in seeking justice and obtaining justice. Honduras now has relieved partially the lockdown measures. So we have the free circulation of people. We have introduced the vaccination campaign. And so that's the stage we are currently in. So we may conclude as a whole that the priority, the top priority was for people to be able to enjoy and safety and security, and also be allowed to freely circulate and especially to have the opportunity to access justice. As far as the legal systems are concerned, I have to say that we succeeded in containing the infections and the spread of the pandemic in these months, in the last few months. Unfortunately, we had to limit the visits for the inmates, and we have introduced and rolled out a safety protocol. So the implementation of such protocol, of course, required the engagement and the cooperation by many people. I mean, people working in the security and sector, and also safety sector, but people who got infected themselves. And so then we have introduced a special plan to contain and limit the spread of the disease within prisons. I thank you for the attention, and I am really looking forward to the debate.
Thank you very much, Advocate Rosa. Advocate Sharon, I couldn't stop you because you were saying very interesting, innovative things about what Honduras has done, including what I heard of the setting up of the Women's Court, the role of technology, but your deep down dive into the question of indigenous people and how access to justice was for them, because we know across the Central and Latin American region, there has been a real challenge of indigenous people accessing justice and being impacted by COVID-19 the most. So you have surfaced a number of issues that I think the audience would like to follow up with you on. So without further ado, I want to leave Central America and come to the continent of Africa, in which we want to listen now to Judge Roosevelt Willie, who is currently a judge of Criminal Court A in Liberia. Fantastic to be hearing from you, the country of George Weah, whom most football fans associate with very much. Judge Willie serves as the judge of the Criminal Court A, as I said, and is also president of the National Association of Trial Judges, which is made up of about 500 judges and magistrates. So that's a big institution you lead. And as judge in Liberia, which we know is a country that is emerging from almost 14 years, if not more, of civil crisis, including conflict in which we lost significant numbers of people. One of his major roles as a judge is to assist in building and sustaining peace, which we know is vital to the SDG that we are targeting. In 2014, Judge Willie, during the administration of Judge James E. Jones as president of the association, him along with Judge Joseph received the NATJL Award of Honor as the judges who were the most hardworking and showed the most integrity. That's very important. Finally, by way of background, Judge Willie graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Secondary Education from the William V.S. Tubman Teachers College at the University of Liberia in 1985. And after teaching for several years, he enrolled at the Louis Arthur Grimes School of Law at the University of Liberia, where he earned a Bachelor of Laws degree in 2006. In 2010, Judge Willie received a scholarship to attend the John B. Kroc School of Peace Studies, where in 2011 he earned a master's degree in peace and justice with concentration in human security and international human rights. And I like the particular emphasis and concentration on human security, because on the continent, sometimes we prioritize regime security instead of human security. So that makes you very qualified to speak to the topic of the day, and you can walk across the 5 guiding questions, but please can you also take 5 to 7 minutes so that we can leave time for people to ask you questions. But we invite you now, Judge Willie, to take the floor. Over to you, sir.
Okay. Am I being heard?
Loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. Okay, just
so we can see you as well, so you can just unmute your camera so that we can see you talk.
Should I? Okay. I should do what? Okay. So as you have introduced me, the only correction I would like to make is that presently I'm not a president of the trial judges any longer. We had an election this year, and I turned over to a female. So a female now, Judge Eva Marby Morgan, is now the new president of the Trial Judges Association. But all other things you have said about me, I stay on course. Now, having said that, in order to address the topics as have been given to me, and just as you said, our country just came from 14 years of civil war, about more than a decade ago. And one of the things that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommended for implementation by our government is the establishment of a war and economic crimes court. Fortunately, we have not so far established those courts, and therefore people are going around with impunity and think that people who committed crimes can attain power and remain there and just do what it can do. And so as a result, besides some increment in the rate of crime that is now available because of the pandemic, because of impunity due to the lack of implementation of the War and Economic Crime Code, it has increased tremendously in Liberia. So For us in Liberia, I want to say here that the pandemic has not been as serious like other countries around the world or in Africa. It was sometime in last year, 2020, around February, March, that we realized that one of the top government officials who visited a country came back with a pandemic here. And so from the government put a system in place through the Ministry of Health so as to protect the entire citizenry. And as a result of that, the judiciary came up with several actions so as to make sure that this pandemic does not affect majority or most of the citizenry in Liberia. So for example, the judiciary suspended jury trial. Jury trial under our law is constitutional. So when somebody is accused of indictable offense, the person has a right to say, I need a jury trial. But because the jury, we have about 15 at most members of the jury, and they will sit closer together. So the Supreme Court had to suspend trial by jury, and that executive order was executive order number 8, suspending jury trial. It was also judicial order number 8 instituted by the Supreme Court, and so we suspended jury trial. And as a result, majority of inmates that had their cases that were indictable, we could not try them. So as a result, we had delay in some cases. Also, the judiciary sent out circular to reduce the number of cases that should be had to 2 maximum per day. Ordinarily, and during normal time, a court can hear more than 2-3 cases a day, but because of the pandemic, they usually issue a circular that the courts should hear a maximum 2 cases. And we also want to say here that the judiciary also place staffers, co-staffer on compulsory leave, meaning that the number of staff that worked in the particular court were reduced because of the pandemic. Also, I will state here that the judiciary also distributed COVID materials so as to allow judges and party litigants to wear face masks, wash hands before you enter any court where cases are being had. Now, so because of that, as I said, we could not conduct regular trials for cases due to the pandemic. And also, another question is how did the judiciary respond to that? I've already said that the judiciary reduced number of records. The judiciary also provided materials for judges and party litigants to use. And also, we schedule what we call plea bargaining sessions for for inmates at the prison compound, especially for those who committed lesser offenses, because our prison compound here is overcrowded. It was built in the 70s for only 350 inmates or person at a time. But as we speak, because of the increment, the number of crimes in our country, we have more than 1,000 people in a prison compound that were built to accommodate 350 persons. So we instituted what we call plea bargaining, and we made people who committed lesser crime to be signed for what we call personal reconnaissance, and their cases are pending. So those are some of the initiatives that we have taken here to in the prison compound, for example. The problem there is,
Judge, I'm asking you to wind up as well so that you speak within time.
Okay, so briefly, that's what I want to say for now, and then if there are any questions, then I can answer. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Judge, for giving us that perspective. And we had some innovation from Honduras. We are hearing some problems in Liberia, which actually speaks to the question of the impact of COVID-19 on limiting justice, because 2 cases per day and staff reduction in days of working, really represent the problems that we saw across most of Africa. And then the question of overcrowding, and many of the governments who took decisions to empty prisons of lesser crimes, was that point there was consistent with what we saw across the continent. So thank you for sharing the Liberia story. We want to go next, and we are moving from one part of the globe to another. Now we want to go to Jordan and receive the input from Ms. Hadil Abdelaziz, who is the Executive Director of the Jordan Center for Legal Aid. The legal aid program is an important one in the assortment of strategies to deliver justice in Jordan. Adil Abdelaziz is a founding member of the Jordan NGO Justice Center for Legal Aid. She's a founding member of that. And the Legal Aid Center is dedicated to ensuring everyone has equal access to justice. And the entity works to make this objective a reality through operating a national network of legal aid clinics that are providing very qualitative legal services to poor people, as well as implementing a national legal literacy program and advocating for reforms in the justice sector, including the establishment of national legal aid systems. Hadil is one of those few people who hold 2 BA degrees in management and law, is the first Jordanian to be certified as a judicial administrator by the Michigan State University, and brings to us over 20 years of practical experience, mainly focused in judicial reform, court automation, and access to justice areas. She also serves as a member of the Board of Trustees of the National Center for Human Rights and a member of the national team for combating domestic violence in Jordan. So there is no better qualified person in Jordan to bring us a perspective of how the COVID-19 has impacted on delivering justice, and she will speak also across the 5 guiding questions. So over to you, please take your 5, maximum 7 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction. And I will try to be brief. Like Honduras and Liberia and many other countries, Jordan also introduced lockdown measures and tried to limit mobility of the people. And part of it was to also reduce access to the courts. We had a 3-month full-time lockdown. During that time, courts did not stop, but they were very limited to criminal cases that were already ongoing. lawyers had very limited access. So the justice sector in general, I can say that it suffered. It is known that that whenever you have a crisis, and this is something that I think we have all came to learn, that crisis does not hit people equally. People suffer differently, and the poor are more likely to suffer, and not just from one aspect. So COVID was not just about health. It also revealed the fragility of response systems, protection systems in many, in all areas. And one of them is justice. So people who first of all, people who had no access to the internet, most of the response systems, Jordan, like other jurisdictions, also introduced remote courts to be able to respond to COVID. And but people who had no access to internet found themselves not having access to basic services, education for children, even registering to get health and food coupons, a license to move. You know, like we had permits of mobility permits during the lockdown. All of those were done online, and despite that, Jordan has a strong internet system all aboard, but it's paid, and the poor would usually not have access to either smart devices or the internet. So I will go to lessons learned in a moment, but I just also want to discuss the impact on women, and as many other jurisdictions, also domestic abuse increased. People were being locked down, poverty increased, people had no access to report abuse, or less likely to have access. Schools that once played a significant role in identifying abuse against children, they were stopped, so the children were all confined and they had no access to for protection in many cases. Also, legal aid organizations like the organization Justice Center, the one that I manage, is also, we had less resources because apparently most donors had other priorities, and most of them focused on getting food and money, distribute money and aid. But justice came second at the beginning of the crisis, and the more it seemed that people who needed more help were less likely to have resources to serve them. So that's in general the responses, like the silver lining or the opportunities that arise with the COVID crisis. First of all, was court automation and the court remote courts introduction. That is a brilliant opportunity, but at the same time it comes with a lesson learned, which is we should always devise and design responses to accommodate the most vulnerable persons. So it does not make sense to design something that would exclude people who had no internet access. And even today, the government of Jordan introduced a new decision that those who did not get the vaccination, they would not be allowed in public premises or public institutions, which is, again, this goes against the Constitution, and organizations like us will have to fight this. Another silver lining or another opportunity, which is the reduction in detention orders. So the government or the courts actually issued the decisions to release detainees for crimes that were not serious crimes, and more use of alternative sentencing and community sentencing was used. And this was a great opportunity that if you could do it, why we needed a crisis, a COVID crisis, in order to be introduced. It was already in the law, but it has not been properly used. And now we have, the courts are more inclined to use alternative sentencing, which is again an opportunity. Jordan had issued many what we call defense order because we went into emergency law, and with that, that meant that people who were breaking the lockdown were going to be detained. And what happened was that although they decreased detainees, but in fact, hundreds of people found themselves again detained because of breaking the lockdown and the defense law. The penalty was fine, but of course, poor people who could not pay the fine, then the fine would be transferred into detention time. And again, we are talking about inequality and how the crisis and hits people differently, and therefore the responses should be designed differently. Labor issues are a huge issue here in Jordan because of the defense law limited gave certain authority to the employers to reduce pay. At the same time, did not allow for ending of the contract of the employees, and that was that created many challenges and created a lot of need and lots of uncertainty in the application of the law. The lessons learned, or what I would actually when I answer what is our role, I think that judges, lawyers, and legal authorities, they have the responsibility to think of the spirit of the law when it comes to crisis, when they interpret law, and when they create judgments. People who break the law because their children will go hungry unless they go out and try to work, they're not going to think about what the law says or what the defense order says. While a more affluent person is more likely to stay in his or her home and not break the law. So these things should be considered, and alternative solutions should be created. We should always also, judges should be the protectors of human rights and basic rights, because like in Jordan, and I am sure in many other jurisdictions, the crisis was an opportunity to even practice more authority than that was needed, limiting mobility, limiting freedom of speech, and the constitutional rights. Crisis should never be tolerated as an excuse to defy or to limit constitutional rights. And I think that would lay another burden, an additional burden on judges to ensure that they are the safe guardians of the Constitution and of human rights. Final recommendation: invest in legal aid and access to justice, and don't treat them as if they are not a priority, because they could be the only protection that we have in the long run of mitigating the impact of the crisis on the most vulnerable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hadil, for a very concise input. And I take on board, your initial point that, the COVID-19 came to countries with pre-existing challenges of inequality and fragility. And therefore the impact obviously has to be disaggregated based on where you are geographically, gender you have, economic status, and the various things that you have outlined. You also spoke very much of the limitation of moving from offline justice delivery systems to online justice delivery system, being a stage which plays out the inequality and fragility that many countries that we are discussing here about have experienced. But also it was useful to hear you reflect a little bit on how, in a country like Jordan, you started to deliver or to use more readily alternative justice delivery mechanisms that were on the law, but there'd never been momentum to use them. It will be good when we go to Q&A for you to deep dive into that question of to what extent have that platform of alternative justice delivery mechanisms actually addressed justice for those who are justice seeking in your country. And then, of course, the defense orders and many other places where the poor can simply not be able to comply with the law because they have to survive. And then we end up criminalizing poverty. So very, very important set of inputs that dovetail with what we have heard from the judge and the advocate who spoke before you. Now I want to move on from Jordan and go to Mongolia. And I think in the spirit of being intergenerational, I want to invite Mr. Yosuke Tumobata from the National University of Mongolia. I am sorry if I assassinated your name. Mine gets assassinated too, so don't worry too much about that. But Yosuke is a lecturer in the Department of Political Science at the National University of Mongolia. He holds a master's degree in political science from the National University of Mongolia, and he completed his master's thesis on human rights-based approach and methods of planning public policies, and has since been providing technical assistance to the Minister of Finance on results-based management. He's a former chair of the Mongolian Youth Council, where currently he sits as chair of the board. He was also coordination of the Wind of Change, an NGO supporting citizenship education and participation of young people in the country. And the good thing is that Yosuke will focus his response on the guiding principles from a youth perspective. So looking at justice from a youth perspective and how COVID-19 has impacted on this sector in terms of justice-seeking communities of that sector. So you have your 5 minutes, and since you are speaking from the youth, I think you are going to observe these 5 minutes. Thank you. Over to you. Give us the perspective from Mongolia.
Thank you, Muchena. Good evening, honorable guests. And it's over midnight in Ulaanbaatar, and we are currently in full lockdown in our capital city because the COVID-19 cases are rapidly increased in Mongolia, and Mongolian government trying to manage the decreased cases and deaths because of the pandemic. And but everything has been messed up here, and the young people are very disappointed at the actions and the results of the government. And and state as a primary duty bearer shall be obliged to protect and prevent family, community, and young people from any violent act and security safety by progressive achievements. And now state shall consider and aim to inequality caused by social and economic gaps and negative factors in national level and take all necessary measurements regarding systemic and malpractice and discrimination. And according to crime statistics in Mongolia from the police office, that before the COVID-19 situation, 88% of domestic violence victims was women, and 57% of them was young people. And thus there are rapid response and the measurements shall be taken against violence against women and young people. And also, National Human Rights Commission of Mongolia reported that LGBT people are facing discrimination, and 80% of them were victims of discrimination or human rights violations within last 3 years. And the situation in Mongolia is like that. And during the lockdown in Mongolia, rate of domestic violence has been increased, and government forced almost all the public servants, such as police officers and doctors, to manage COVID-19 situation. And this caused the lack of human resources and other resources to prevent and take actions against the domestic violence and other crimes, such as providing protection to the victims. And furthermore, government tried to restrict the participation of civil society. Because of the lockdown, NGOs and human rights activists cannot be actively involved in decision-making process and implementation at any level. And using such a situation, politicians and high-ranking government officials tried to affect judiciary system and weaken the law enforcement. And using pandemic crisis by distraction, politicians are trying to submit and amend the crucial laws, such as the law of NGO, law of court, to restrict the actions of justice seekers and human rights defenders. And as a human rights activists, we shall use digital possibilities that we can use using during the pandemic crisis to express our voices and keep an eye on what politicians and government officials doing. And government need to seize this opportunity to young people instead of the unethical attempts to restrict the civic participation. And finally, and I'm really sure that young people in Mongolia, also the young people around the world, have the innovative ideas and modern solutions, such as using the new digital technologies to the justice system and citizenship, civic participation to promote peaceful, equitable, and sustainable recovery from the COVID-19 situation. So then government around the world need to create meaningful partnership with the young people and civil society. And with this partnership of innovative ideas from young people and willingness of government, we can make better recovery from pandemic crisis. Yeah, thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, brother, for the big input that you gave. And Yeshke, you focus on young people's status and access to justice, and the important statistics you offered on both gender-based violence, but as well as what's happening with the relationship between young people and violence in Mongolia is completely is very deep. And thank you for introducing the extra dimension of discrimination on LGBTI people that you raised there as part of the overall COVID-19 pandemic and the manner in which it has shaped justice. And the fact that we are still on full lockdown represents for us the fact that the issues we are discussing are not in the past, they are in the present, they are also in the future. So thank you for that contribution. We'll come back to you and draw from you a lot more perspectives on what this has meant for justice seekers among young people. We now want to go to our second last person. So we're doing well. I hope that we can move very quickly. And we are back on the continent in Tunisia, in Tunis, where we shall be listening now to Judge Ali Agabi, who is a judge in Tunis, Tunisia, but also is importantly a member of the Tunisian Association of Women Judges in Tunisia. So I think we will be hearing her speak across the 5 guiding questions, but also importantly, the perspective of the women's judges in Tunisia. Important background for Judge Ali Agabi is that she graduated with a master's degree in private law from the Faculty of Law and Political Science of Tunis, and a graduation diploma from the Higher Institute of Magistracy, which she began in 2020, and has been exercising her functions as a judge within the Court of First Instance of Monastir for 3 years, during which she rotated several chambers and specialities, namely civil, commercial, and criminal. Importantly, in 2013, she became part of the Tunis Court of First Instance as a member of the pilot civil chamber. And from 2015 to 2020, she has been appointed or was appointed as the cantonal judge of Tunis, where she chaired a civil chamber handling cases of compensation for damages caused by work accidents and occupational diseases, as well as exclusive competence. Since 2020, she was appointed as advisor in the Tunis Court of Appeal. Her academic and professional paths were consolidated by trainings in different fields, including continuing education in tax law, training on the administration of justice, as well as with the Institute of Netherlands in 2014, where she did training on legislation with Silk Institute in Netherlands in 2018, as well as training in arbitration. So we have here a person of supreme qualifications in terms of the breadth of the law, as well as interaction with a variety of constituencies who need the law to meet their justice needs. So we'll ask you, Judge Ali Agabi, to reflect on the 5 questions from the perspective of where you are in Tunis, and please take your 5 minutes as well. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, dear panelists. It's just an honor to be a part of this panel today. Also, thanks should go to Idlo for giving me this opportunity to participate in this important conference. Justice systems today are being combated by powerful global forces. COVID-19 has created huge challenges for delivering justice while protecting public health. Mid and long-term shifts in technology, politics, and regulation are creating threats as well as opportunities to serve the public effectively. Access to Tunisian courts has been severely limited during the pandemic. The suspension of judicial proceeding to counter the spread of the virus. The category of urgent cases includes criminal cases involving detention and violation of government orders related to the pandemic, domestic violence, child protection, civil and family, and administrative matters, which are all deemed as urgent by the president of the courts. The restricted access with courts limited to urgent matters also led to divergent interpretations and situations. Some courts kept receiving complaints of a particular nature, while others did not. During the pandemic, Tunisia made legal changes to be able to conduct remote hearings in criminal matters in cases of an imminent threat or to prevent risks of transmission of diseases without the consent of the defendant. In normal times, the legal changes provide that remote hearings can be held and the demand of the court, the prosecutor, or the defendant. The defendant's consent is required outside cases of pandemics or similar crises. During the first wave of the pandemic, the use of virtual hearing was limited. During the second and third wave, it had become more common. At the time of writing, courts of first instance, 5 administrative courts, and 8 penitentiary establishments were fully equipped to conduct remote hearing, and there were plans to equip more tribunals. For example, remote hearing may be used quickly in the first instance courts of Tunisia too. Thus, the judicial system has recently experienced a major change, starting with organizing the work in courts through notes issued by the Supreme Judiciary Council, which determine the type of cases to be dealt with, such as emergency cases, arrest cases, daily life cases, and also setting procedures to be followed for the protection of judges and litigants. On the other hand, the Department of Public Prosecution is in charge of imposing quarantine, whether it's compulsory or not, and found itself dealing with the new crimes linked to the novel coronavirus. The effort in courts has differed from one to another in the application of some laws. There have been ones that applicated the Emergency Act and others that applicated the Communicable Disease Act. This difference has led to different penalties issued in Tunisian courts, which has affected the principle of a fair trial, which has been solved later on. The notion of a fair trial guarantees the principle of public hearing. In the beginning of this pandemic, it was hard to bring arrested people from prisons to avoid the spread of the virus. And by doing that is affected the retention delay and the ability to question and hear the accused. This crisis has made all parties involved in the judicial system to seek new means to achieve a fair trial, and that led to activate remote trials. As the novel corona being a serious threat towards humanity, high awareness of this pandemic during quarantines had led to achieve multiple results. The first result is about during the pandemic, several courts used new communication tools to respond to the limitation on access. This consisted mainly of phone and email communication, which was much less used before the pandemic. The National Order of Lawyers, for example, created an email address in collaboration with the Tunisian Post Company, where lawyers can exchange reports. The third result, lawyers, courts, and associations in contact with justice seekers have started to use display system to a great extent during the pandemic. These displays are boards, list information on the status of cases, court session, and even simplified guides informing about procedures or rights. Amplifying the use of physical display system outside of courts would facilitate transmission of information from justice providers to justice seekers. The fourth result, eliminating normal cases and focusing on crimes related to COVID-19. Many people have not been able to seek justice and file complaints because courts have been closed down during quarantine, and we can stipulate the growth of the phenomenon of violence against women during quarantine and the struggle in order to seek justice as a major example. This issue may be combined to the access to justice, which has been impacted in various ways, especially for these vulnerable people, from courts being closed and case blackouts buildings up to the passing of rights restricting emergency legislation that will possibly have long-term adverse effects. The sixth result, limiting the review to only arrested people cases and not looking into released cases, had led to damaging both suspects and victims, and the accumulation, of course, of unreviewed cases. I can conclude by saying that the judicial system has dealt with the pandemic in a different way from one time to another. Take us into consideration all these difficulties, and it has evolved with the situation. So quarantines was the first step, and then other measures have been taken, and with that, new laws have been invented to make sure that our public health is unharmed. The Tunisian judicial system, although is modest potential and degraded infrastructure, is still trying to find the proper solution in order to acclimate with the pandemic and to protect judges, litigants, and all other parties involved in the judicial system, and make sure that all citizens are able to seek justice without facing any problems. Many thanks for your attention.
Wow. Thank you so much, Judge Gabi, for that input from the perspective of Tunisia. And like your counterparts, you have also spoken to the determination to provide justice, notwithstanding the crisis, including the remote hearing that you spoke about, and also raising the spectra of violence against women and a justice system that was evolving depending on where we were in the evolution of the pandemic. Thank you very much for that, and I think there will be a few questions in your direction when we open up for the questions. Now we want to get to our last speaker so that we can create some time for questions. And, you know, it's always good to end with the UN, you know, so that we can get a summation. So we have Mr. Alejandro Alvarez, who is the director of the Rule of Law Unit in the Executive Office of the Secretary General at the United Nations. Alejandro, since April 2017, has been the director of the Rule of Law Unit in this office, as I've indicated. His role essentially is to coordinate the work of the UN in support of the rule of law initiative and develop systems-wide policies. His office is also the focal point at the EOSJ for counterterrorism, drugs and crime, genocide prevention, sexual violence in conflict and human rights. Previously, Mr. Alvarez was the team leader for the rule of law, justice, security, and human rights at the United Nations Development Program. supremely qualified to speak on from where you are sitting, how you have seen delivering justice in the context of COVID-19. 5 minutes, please. Please, over to you.
Thank you, sir, and thank you to IDLO and to my colleagues in DESA for inviting me. I'm representing my colleague, Assistant Secretary General Volker Turk, who couldn't make it for this event as he's actually, home resting for a little bit. I will take a slight different angle for this conversation, if you don't mind, as I am not going to refer to a particular country experience. I will try to share with you some of our preoccupations that are related to the justice system and to democracy at large. Let me, the United Nations recently and during the pandemic has been issuing a number of products, to guide and to support member states to deal with the pandemic from a justice point of view. I would invite you to look at the Secretary General's policy brief on COVID and human rights. That was launched in June, and there's also guidelines related to incarceration and a number of other important topics. Some of you have referred to that. But I would like to share those reflections related at large on democracy. Listen, in 2019, you may remember that we had a large protest movement, or large protest movements across the planet. It was quite amazing to see very different places like Lebanon or Chile or Ecuador or Iraq, people going to the streets to protest against government's policies. Studies on that regard show that mostly people were very upset and angry against politicians, against leaders in general, and protesting against inequalities, gender-based violence, corruption. There was a large movement that when the pandemic hit, in a way, all those movements have stopped or put on hold, if you wish. But those situations were clearly expressing people's anger against and mistrust against institutions and leadership. I had to remember as well, I had to remind as well that, in many cases, this anger has found expression in elections, and many anti-system candidates even won the election in many large countries in both the developed and developing world. So the democracy and the trust in institutions have been taking a large hit during those movements. Now, that was pre-pandemic. During the pandemic, we've been seeing a number of things like, disinformation campaigns, extremism, hate speech, in a moment where governments were asking the population to take unprecedented risks on one side, but also there were measures that restricted liberties, to contain the pandemic. So that was, that has been already for one year and a half. And during that time, we also been seeing, an increased mistrust in the information that was provided by governments, mistrust related to the vaccines, fake news issues and hate speech, and as I said. And so in a way, we don't see that there is much reason to believe that after the pandemic, there won't be those protest movements as we have seen them before. And it will, and in the way that the planet in general, all countries manage their recovery from the pandemic, will mark certainly how people will react to institutions. I just want to, in a way, liberal democracies or democracies in general, liberal democracies are working under the understanding that my generation will be better off than the previous generation, and my children will be better off than my generation. And that hope is actually not working anymore in many countries. So questions are about, well, why do we have these institutions? Why do we have these leaders? Why do we have this democracy? And this is a serious threat to the way that we are trying to build our planet, our institutions, our democracies, our sustained human rights. So, and the justice system has played a tremendous important role in the declining of trust of institutions. The justice sector, is still, being seen, and I want to say this, with candor, but at the same time, as a real warning, because I'm not sure that reformers, we are taking enough of a grasp of how serious is the situation. People think that the justice system is actually unable to solve normal problems. And they are also unable to put limits to power, like corruption, for example. But they are also, are perceived as sitting on their privileges. In many countries, including mine, the justice system and the judges, decided they are not going to pay income taxes, for example. In many other countries, they have privileges like importing cars without taxes or keeping. I mean, those things are just so unacceptable for people. And this is the image that the justice system has been building, on itself for a long period of time. And when a big crisis like the pandemic is hitting, the deficit of trust is very serious. So as we move forward, we believe that there is, an effort that has to be made, and that is not only related to, of course, you might have seen in the Pathfinder's report, Justice for All, there's a big effort, to make the case that the justice system is not delivering for everybody. So that Justice for All effort, needs to be part of our reform efforts. That is for sure. But some other research is showing that not because you are delivering more, people will actually trust the justice system more. So there is an effort that we need to do, and I hope that the pandemic recovery plans will also help us to think on that regard. The justice system needs to regain credibility and trust with the population. And this is a particular effort that needs to be taken. People need to recover a public service spirit. People need to come, the experience of people coming to the courts and to the ministries need to improve seriously. And this is, we don't know much about how to rebuild trust, but this is, an effort that I am, that we are, looking very much to reflect more with the United Nations member states and the rule of law global community. Please, the decline in trust of the justice system and the institutions serious threat for our future. So our call is, let's look at this seriously and let's act upon that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alejandro Alvarez, for, I think you introduced an issue that did not come in from fellow panelists, which is this concept of trust and the role that the judiciary or the justice sector can play. It's a tremendously important point, because we know across the world that there are countries that have weaponized COVID-19 to implement political authoritarian consolidation in the national territory, including, weaponizing or instrumentalizing the judiciary as a site of political persecution in the name of prosecution. So for the judiciary that has allowed itself to be used like that, it has of course contributed to the decline of trust in institutions that are central to delivering SDG 16. So I think that's a powerful submission that we need to be looking at as we go forward. Now, we've come to the end of the input from the panelists. We have about 10 minutes. I was going to ask that we put maybe 5 more minutes into our conversation so that we can take as many questions from colleagues who have a lot more questions to ask, which is where we need to go to now. I would just ask that people be brief so that they can leave early. Already we had questions that had been put forward by Asa Ilmi from Indonesia, from the Judicial Research Society, who had a question, how do we ensure that evidence-based policy making in pandemic era or in the pandemic era, while the availability, awareness, and knowledge about data itself is still lacking? How do we ensure that? That was the question that was already posted. We also have David Sierra Guterres, who had asked the question, how can one address the pandemic situation on highly informal economies? What are the lessons from the responses of public institutions? And I think a lot of our countries do have this dual and enclave nature of their economy. So these are 2 central questions that already have been put forward. And I want to see if there are additional questions that are coming from the floor. And I'm looking to Nick to highlight if there is any additional question that we need to front load before we ask for any more additional questions.
Hi, there are no more questions.
No more questions?
So we just promoted Arsen and David to the floor, so perhaps they could ask the questions themselves.
Okay, all right. So please let Asa come in and David to refresh their questions.
Okay, hello. Everyone, my name is Arsa. I'm from Indonesia Judicial Research Society, and thank you so much for such a great opportunity to participate in this forum. Well, I have one question for all of the speakers that maybe become a problem in many countries far before pandemic hit us, and it becomes more challenging during this COVID-19 era. For many occasions, we rely on government administrative data to assess people legal needs, but most of the time, those data are not well integrated among ministries or agencies and not accessible or represents the real condition, and even sometimes the stakeholders doesn't quite understand the importance of the data or even how to interpret the data to make the right decision. And moreover, it's also challenging to collect or gather data from citizens in national scale level. Meanwhile, in this crucial time, everything needs to be decided as fast as possible while still ensure that aspects like human rights and access to justice is not neglected, and also ensure that vulnerable groups' needs are met. So my question is, how can we ensure evidence-based policy making during the COVID-19 era when the availability of comprehensive data is still limited? So that's it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for your question. And I think the specific aspects on data could probably go to Alejandro and Hadiz Aziz, because you looked at the Legal Aid Society and what it was doing there. So thank you, Asa. I think there was, I think it could be useful if we can get David to amplify your question. David Sierra Guterres, do you want to amplify your question as well?
Yes, thank you very much. So thank you very much for the opportunity to ask my question. So the lockdown and other restrictions implemented to contain the pandemic has been especially hard on vulnerable workers around the world. In developing countries such as mine, I'm professor at the Superior School of Public Administration in Colombia. So in developing countries such as mine, which are characterized by highly informal economies, there is neither the sufficient institutional capacity, especially in social security systems, nor the resources to appropriately assist workers and the unemployed affected by the crisis. So this seems to be adding to the exacerbation of social conflicts that might end up undermining the rule of law, thus, among other things, putting more weight on justice systems on the coming years, which is very delicate in countries that are also going through a transitional justice processes for peace building, such as Colombia. So the achievement of the SDG 16 is in a critical moment in this kind of countries in particular. So my question to the panelists is, from your experience, do you have any insights on what kind of measures could come from the justice institutions in responding to the needs of vulnerable workers within informal economies? Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. It's a powerful question. And as I indicated, I think we have dual and enclave economies across all the developing world. You know, you ask for people to lock down or to self-isolate or to social distance in a slum community, that's not possible. And we found most of our countries going through that. So it would be good to get from panelists what your experience has been. There's been a couple of questions posted in the chat. One from Martina in Italy was, how can the digital transformation improve access to justice and increase trust of people? You know, which is Alejandro's point. Margarita is very thankful for the organizers for giving us a wide spectrum of issues that have come from different countries, and it has improved their own understanding of access to justice. So with that, let's just give panelists to take 1 minute or two each to answer the questions from where you are sitting. Firstly with David, and ask us questions, and then the one from Margarita around you know, digital access. Who wants to start first? Who is moved by the Holy Spirit to start first from the panelists? We start the way we started. Let's start with Honduras, Advocate Rosa.
Muchas gracias. Creemos, y tal como lo expuse, que es un gran desafío la era digital en relación a la justicia, porque en países como Honduras no todas las poblaciones cuentan con esta nueva tecnología. No obstante, no podemos negar que viene a, de una u otra forma, a garantizar el derecho al acceso a la justicia para ciertas poblaciones que sí tienen esa nueva tecnología. En Honduras, considero que la apertura social y económica que hemos tenido bajo medidas de seguridad ha venido a aliviar el derecho, aliviar los obstáculos que hay al derecho a la justicia. El gran reto que tenemos ahora ya no es el derecho al acceso a la justicia, que la gente pueda trasladarse a un tribunal o que los abogados puedan garantizar este derecho, los jueces también.
Furthermore, the lockdown measures and the reduction in mobility made it impossible for people to move and actually physically get to court. In addition to the fact that we were not ready to use technologies yet. So we have to take urgent measures so that access to justice would not be yet another victim of the COVID pandemic. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Advocate Rosa, for that response. Let me come to Judge Willie. And I think it would be important for you, Judge, to address the access to justice in informalized context, because Liberia does have that structural nature of informal economy, or an economy that is very formalized, educated, accessible, and then another which is completely closed off one of these opportunities where, as we say, real people live. So I think you might want to tackle that as well.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. From what I said, before I even answer that question, there are a lot of lessons we have learned since this pandemic, and the policies and action that have been put in place. So, for example, the issue of using virtual or Zoom technology for opening of courts and certain trials, we didn't have it here before. In fact, our training sessions that we conducted quarterly have even been suspended because of the pandemic. So we are now learning new technology as far as the issue may be. Talking about the informalized section of our justice system. Of course, in our country here, as I said again, we have majority of our people who are illiterate. And of course, for the few that are literate, it has become very difficult for us to conduct cases and implement some of the policies that we want to do, because majority of the people are not even lettered. So those are some of the issues that we face here in Liberia. Again, so the issue of using technology to conduct trials and conduct other training as other countries are doing or other jurisdictions are doing, we are not doing it because these things were not taught to us. It is only for now that we are doing it. So we just hope and pray that these trainings and some other by other institutions and other opportunities will assist us to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judge. And I think just on the issue of this access to justice and the division that is created by inequality, Matthew Lindley had posted in the chat a while back, essentially raising the issue that the pandemic has demonstrated that piecemeal progress in building legal and judicial capacity has failed justice seekers. And Matthew makes the point that we need to make the case for national and donor support to scale up cost-effective justice programs that respond to the vast majority of justice seekers. I think this point dovetails with the point you have made, Judge, but also with the question of informal economy. So thank you very much for that. Yeshke, do you have any particular response to the questions that have come through? Please, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions, and I'm totally agree with Alejandro's point that we need to increase the trust, public trust to the official institutions, and also such a developing countries like Mongolia, there is the mistrust of the people to the government is rapidly increasing, and yeah, and answer of that conflict is the digital technology for me, and because the new technologies are can create the data and that expose the data to the public, and or expose the decision-making process and justice system to the public, and this makes more people they increase the trust to these institutions, and that's my point of the digital transformation related questions. And yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, and for being brief as well. Let me invite Judge Alia Gabi. You also can provide, a perspective, including the first questions from Asa about are we using an evidence base, or the question from David Sierra on informal economies. We know Tunisia is a site also where you can study inequality, going back to the case of Tariq Mohammed Bouaziz. What he demonstrated there was inequality is an issue. Is there any perspective you want to shed on this? Judge Alia Gabi, are you still there? Okay, we might have lost her. Let's go to Alejandro Alvarez. You provoked a conversation on trust, and questions have come flying back to you. You wanna take another 1 minute to respond?
Sure, I can do. I'm happy to do that, but I think that Judge Aziz was before in the line. But whatever order you prefer, I'm happy to answer right now or to wait.
Sorry, I didn't. Can you come again?
Oh no, it's okay. I will go ahead and then listen. I've been looking at the questions. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So and for sure, I would say that the digital transformation is a must, and it has to be adopted by the justice system. Now, I would say two things. One, it shouldn't be that complicated because, during the pandemic now we are all doing this, online things. It shouldn't be that complicated for the justice system to adopt new ways of working. It's just that the culture in the justice system is so formalized, formalized that and it's so rigid that it takes a lot of time, to change. But I think that, the pandemic, it's bringing one opportunity for that. Second, even if we are going through a digital transformation, that might help with the trust issue, but it will not make it all, because still the trust deficit is related to two things or three things, as I mentioned. One is the justice system is still part of the problem when it comes to the deficit of trust to leaders. The justice system is not putting enough limits to power, and it's a structural problem with trust. Second, the justice system is still sitting on their privileges, and this is outrageous for a public servant. I mean, I don't know how to say it in a way that is, that the message goes across. It's been generations already that we are doing. At one point in time, it was important that for many countries that the justice system was built in terms of authority, the authority of the law, and we needed to build the image of the judge as someone that could say the law. But this is the past. That is not anymore what we need right now. What we need now is public servants. So what we need is to think from someone that has a problem and has to go to a court or to a police station. I mean, just think for a minute, what is the experience that people are going through when they are going to police station or to a court? They don't understand, they are treated badly, they are made to wait. I mean, and then at the end, they are not solving the problem. So people come in fear. So that the whole experience need to be improved. Researchers, people from academia need to help the justice system to go through this. So it's a power thing, and it's a people's experience thing that we need to go through. Again and again, I will just say, one thing. This is a serious problem. And the justice system is well behind, any attempt of transformation. So we need a real cultural revolution inside the system just inside the justice system. It's not a joke anymore, because what is happening with institutions, with democracy, is quite existential. Listen, the Secretary General, I didn't say this, in my intervention, but the Secretary General was asked by the General Assembly to produce a report by September on current and future challenges for the planet. This is something that we call our common agenda, and it's coming out of the resolution on the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. The Secretary General will issue this report where he will tell to the world what is his views on what are the issues that we're going to have to solve as a very existential challenge. You can imagine that the issue of climate, the issue of technologies, the issue of inequalities will be there. But in terms of governance, the issue of narrowing the gap in terms of trust and having a new social contract between people and the state will be very much into that conversation. Thank you. I'm sorry I'm taking too much, okay? Too much time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. And you have again spotlighted the distance between justice and ordinary people, and that it needs to be narrowed. You have reinforced the matter of trust. I think you have also answered the question that had been raised by Sandra Lane in the question and answer there. What role do you consider academia plays in fostering trust in justice? How can academic partner? So I thought you addressed that a little. So I wanted to go to Hadil. I haven't forgotten you, so that you can become the closing speaker for responding, so that we close. The time is over. Thank you, Adil.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to address the question about data, but it's going to be also combined by access. This could be a real opportunity for all justice systems, since, as Alejandro mentioned, usually judicial systems are very slow to change, and now they are being forced to change, and this could be our opportunity to improve access to data. But we have to understand that just because the data is being improved because they're using automated systems, it does not mean it will improve access to information, unless, and this is where the judiciary has to play a significant role in enforcing access to information acts and laws. And also the civil society and activists should be forcing and advocating to be part of the design. And perhaps like one of the most important things that have been said here is that we need to shift on how we treat all actors, because people's lives are at stake. So this is not the time to actually safeguard. We do not safeguard the independence of the judiciary by putting them on a pedestal and just ensuring they are not being critiqued or criticized. And this is something that we have in Jordan. It's part of our legal culture. In fact, now the only way to safeguard the judiciary is to ensure they are free from interference in their business and in their judicial decisions, and they are truly acting as saviors and acting as protectors of basic human rights for everyone. So this could be an opportunity, but it could be only that we could only survive the long-term impacts of COVID and this horrible crisis that it has caused from the justice perspective. It can only be done and if we truly believe we need to look not just by fighting the small fire we have ahead, we need a strategic vision that human rights should be protected, and this is our only way out. Thank you.
Can I just make intervention 1 minute?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Talking about the issue of trust concerning the judiciary or the justice system. As I told you, we have 14 years of civil war in my country, Liberia. And one of the reasons that were given by the International Crisis Group for our civil war is that the justice system was one of the root causes of the civil war. And therefore, right after the Civil War, we began to put the system in place so that the justice system could play its role so that we could not have recurrence of any situations such as this. Now, what the pandemic has done because of the negative economic impact, the government have reduced wages to some extent. The government have reduced support to prosecution. Even as I speak, this May term of court coming, the prosecutor have threatened that they will not come for the opening of court. So, in order for to have, if we really want to have trust and transparency and accountability, and we are something so as to make sure that the economic situation of the system is supported. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Willie, for that additional input. Colleagues, you know, this is a fascinating conversation that we have just had for the past 2 hours. And first, really salute to people who have stayed on the call, which is still a significant number from when we started. So really thank you to colleagues who have joined in this conversation. The second is that it is very clear to us that one of the big lessons coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic is the dynamics of access to justice. And from the panelists, they've given us a comprehensive picture, which represents what people have experienced across the globe, which is in the process of trying to innovate. Some people have been left out of technology spaces, and their justice concerns have not been addressed, while at the same time, we can, of course, applaud the fact that the judiciary has evolved, to use one of the panelists' terms, to continue to provide justice even in the context of the pandemic. It is clear that if institutions of justice, peace, and stability are to play a role of moving the world towards attaining Goal 16, institutional leadership, coherence, and competence are going to be important in driving that agenda. But as we learned from the panelists, certainly from Alejandro at the end, is that trust in institutions and the deficit between institutions and where people are continues to undermine the efficacy of things such as justice systems. We also learned that it is possible to consider alternative justice delivery mechanisms when the formalistic ways are inhibited by pandemics such as we have experienced. And that one hopes that the innovations that have taken place in the last year will move us forward in the area of improving access to justice, that we don't draw back to the original state before the pandemic. But if there is anything that we have learned is that the pandemic has essentially amplified pre-existing inequalities that the world was trying to grapple with, from those who work in informal economies to people who live in informal housing contexts and those who live in poverty. When a pandemic requires a national lockdown that does not disaggregate between the impact of those lockdowns on those who are able and capable and protected, and those who are not able, who are incapable and who are not protected. When lockdowns of that nature are imposed on countries, the impact of that and the outcomes that we get on development, on social security, on access to justice necessarily becomes unequal. So COVID-19 is a stage for us to understand the plight of our continent, the plight of our world, the plight of our country, wherever we are. And it is important that we think the lessons we have learned about prioritizing inequality as the basis upon which we think about people who need to access justice is going to be very important as we go forward. And finally, I think the actors that have come together to set this platform, including IDLO, the UN, and others who have worked to make this possible, should be thanked sincerely for continuing to focus on this area that sometimes in different countries we don't focus because the pandemic has just disrupted livelihoods, economies, jobs, has caused so much death that everybody is dealing with so much that a number of the things that we need to protect livelihoods and human rights have been forgotten. So to retain the attention of the world, of the community of practice, back to questions of justice and back to questions of accessing and creating the roadmap towards Goal 16 attainment is something we must applaud So thank you to the organizers and all those who have made it to this point. With that, I think we formally close the meeting, and we will be getting in touch with colleagues that have attended this particular breakaway group if there is anything that we need to do to move forward. So thank you very much. I return the mic back to Nick if there is anything that you need to announce before we conclude the meeting.
Thank you very much. Nothing to add. I think you've eloquently put all the closing statements. Just to say thank you very much to all of the panelists for today, and of course to Pros for moderating such a great session. So I think we can leave it there for now, and we'll close the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody.